Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Jonathan Lethem is the best-selling author of 12 novels, including The Arrest, The Feral Detective, The Fortress of Solitude, and Motherless Brooklyn, winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award. His newest is Brooklyn crime novel, a sweeping story of community, crime, and gentrification, tracing more than 50 years of life in one Brooklyn neighborhood and its black, brown, and white inhabitants. Bookpage says Lethem unwinds his story through a series of small vignettes, imperfect Polaroids of an imperfect past that slowly coalesce into a photo mosaic montage of memoir meets myth. Again, the name of the novel is Brooklyn Crime Novel, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Jonathan Lethem to this week's book show. What a delight to have you here. Thank you so much.
It's such a pleasure to be here and to be in Albany. I'm thrilled about it. Thank you.
It's wonderful to have you back on the show. This novel is quite stunning, and it's something that I will admit to you that I read and then read again because I felt in my first reading that I wanted to revisit it very quickly because there's so much packed into, as I mentioned in the introduction, these small vignettes. How did you come to that particular style, and even in how you knew you wanted to tell this particular story?
Yeah, thank you. I'm honored that you went through it a second time. I had this notion that what I needed to do with my old method of writing about Brooklyn was kind of blow it up into a constellation of fragments and then reassemble it in a different way. And this idea that the book would be multivocal, that I'd include thoughts and feelings that were so far outside of myself that I couldn't even pretend they came from me. And I did, research and interview people, much more like I was writing a nonfiction book in some ways. I went really wide for sources and stimulus and challenges to my own assumptions about this time and place that I'm, personally so invested in. It's in my body, right? It's my personal material. But I didn't think that was enough to do the neighborhood with the breadth that I wanted to. So I sought this kind of super distributed method. And this was really the way that I searched for my material being reflected in the form that the book took. I knew that when it came together, it had to look like my investigation. All of these different pieces, all of these different windows or angles, they all reflect me on a hunt, essentially, on an inquiry.
In that inquiry, does that come from curiosity? Okay, I know this and I know that, and now I want to connect those dots.
I have loads of curiosity about this stuff. I mean, my own, almost like a gawker's fascination at the incredible circumstance of New York City in the 70s, Brooklyn, my neighborhood, gentrification, the things I was witness to, the birth of hip-hop, all kinds of things that I just, are my weird inheritance. I do find them fascinating, but this was also an emotional necessity. I was driven in a way to try to solve or unlock, not necessarily answer questions, but do the best job I could do of framing these, in some cases, terrifying quandaries about race and class and the forces that surrounded us at that moment, at the end of the sort of official civil rights era and the beginning of what was regarded as the rediscovery or replenishment of Brooklyn, but also became its gentrification. The nexus of things that were all, bringing their power to bear on this space that was my childhood. I needed to think about them, and I needed to think about them with help. Other voices, research, lots and lots of points of view besides my own.
The idea of calling it Brooklyn Crime Novel, was that a later decision, or did that almost become a mission statement?
Well, so there's a really peculiar story behind the title, which is worth telling because it became, in a way, like a rallying cry for me. So I agreed to write this book as the back half of a 2-book contract with my publisher because I was feeling so warmly published and taken care of. And I was like, yeah, let's extend this. Let's have you publish this book I'd just written. It was one called The Arrest. Plus, let's add another book into the deal and guarantee my home here for a while. But all I knew and all I said to them was, I'm writing another novel. It's going to be in Brooklyn. I don't have a title. I don't have an outline for you. You're going to have to take it on faith. And they did that. So when the contract came back to me, in the place of where the title would be, someone had inked in Brooklyn crime novel. And I was actually slightly irritated at first. I was like, all I said was Brooklyn. I didn't promise you a crime novel. And, I got kind of cranky for a minute, just in this imagined coercive relationship where they were like, you got to do Motherless Brooklyn over again. Do another Brooklyn crime novel. And I was like, that wasn't what I promised you. But oddly enough, this imaginary sort of figure that I had in my head, someone trying to make me do something, became a really useful argument that I conducted with myself. I was sort of like chip on my shoulder. Oh, you want a crime novel? Okay, I'm going to give you crime, but it's not going to be what you expect. It's not going to be a detective or cops or an investigation or clues and then a solution. Instead, it's going to be this fundamental, in a way, crime as the like organizing paradigm or the lens that I'm going to look at everything through. Because I began to see that the place and the time that I'd come of age inside, me and all these other kids that I wanted to write about, was in some way defined by the atmosphere of crime. And we all had to organize our sense of self in relation to, are we victims? Are we perpetrators? Are we both? And so this became like a kind of rallying cry for the book. And then at the end of the story, ironically, this phrase that had irritated me on the contract, I looked at it and I was like, you know what? Brooklyn crime novel, that's the title too.
And it gets us thinking about what crime is. The book is organized into 6 sections. The first is everybody gets robbed. But of what, right?
Yeah.
Or what are we robbed of?
And maybe the initial answer is simple. Oh yeah, I remember the first thing. Somebody took my bicycle or my bus pass or my, first baseman's mitt when I went out to play. That's easy. When did you enter this experience? But what goes on being robbed from you? And what do you rob from others? I started to see that it was incomplete if I thought that the world divided so neatly into victims and perpetrators, that actually everyone I knew was in some way on both sides of the equation.
Jonathan Lethem is our guest. The name of the new novel is Brooklyn Crime Novel. It is published by Echo. I kept on referring, and I hope you accept my interpretation of this, but almost as a Thornton Wilder stage manager.
That's great.
Type
Yeah.
character that is telling us this story.
I knew that in lieu of some of the things that I was pulling out of my plan, like a traditional protagonist who, simply wants something, he's trying to solve a problem or get something he wants, that I was going to organize the book according to some other driving force. And for me, that driving force was absolutely this voice who is, me and not me. He's an implicit author, someone who's grabbing you by the shirt collar and pulling you close, almost like you're at a bar and you're stuck with him, and saying, we're going to figure this out together. We're going to go on a journey into this place, and it's going to be a crazy set of stories. It's not going to make sense for a while, but my voice is going to be the one continuous force, and we're going to work on this together. And so it's very much direct address, breaks the fourth wall, like you say, like Thornton Wilder's narrator, his stage manager. And, I had several different things that I thought about to encourage me to feel comfortable doing this. But Thornton Wilder's a good example. I also thought about John Dos Passos, the way he fractures his story into documents, evidence, essentially. It's almost like a court case is being assembled, and where there's like a trial lawyer who's going to say, ladies and gentlemen, here's the case against Brooklyn.
Right.
And so I was really letting that prosecuting attorney or that buttonholer, that obsessive voice, the narrator or the stage manager, be the one who you had to, deal with and spend time with in this book.
Because you will say, all right, I know I told you this, but now let's just focus in on this part of the story for a few minutes.
Right.
And spend time with these people so I can give you a little more information as to what happened.
Yeah.
And that has a deliberate action to it that perhaps we may not be used to. But it is, I find it comforting for just the reason that you mentioned, that sometimes you just may not know what is going on at any given moment.
Sure. You know, another example that was very meaningful to me, very personal, was I thought about Kurt Vonnegut in a book
Yeah.
like Slaughterhouse-Five,
Right.
where he basically opens a novel by announcing, I'm not going to be able to do this the regular way. You know, I'm sorry. I was really at Dresden, first of all, and also I can't tell this straight. So deal with this, stick with me. There'll be some asides. I'll be here for you. But he's always present. And so he tells his book in this crazy, shattered, myth-like way, you know, with this time travel and the fantasy and then the facts about the war. And you're with him all the way because he's Kurt Vonnegut. And I thought, I have to invent a voice that I'll be as, you know, that I'll make my reader as comfortable with as I was when I picked up that book at age 14. And, you know, this announcement comes, you know, we're not going by the normal route.
You mentioned Vonnegut in the novel.
Yeah. He was a real touchstone. And in fact, the age that the kids are in this book, the ones on the street, the ones in Brooklyn, is the age I was when I discovered Vonnegut. So I think he was totemic for me because he was one of the people, one of the grown-ups, even though I never met the guy, who helped me organize the chaos of experience.
The chaos of experience is such a fascinating phrase because, I mean, childhood in itself is chaos, right? But then you put a geography on it of this is the chaos of this place that is Brooklyn. And whether we're familiar with Brooklyn or not, you bring us to that chaos. And at least for me, it makes perfect sense because we find so many parallels to our own, for want of a better term, chaos.
Well, I hope it does translate to other geographies. Of course, I think the fundamental insight for me about that experience is that somewhere in the book there's the phrase, the street life was the real life. The children are experiencing one space when they're inside with their parents and the announced childhood, right? Like, this is your family. They're going to talk to you about what you should expect from the world, from school, from friendship, and then you're going to get pushed out the door and down the steps of the stoop and into the street, and the children that you will meet there have another idea entirely, and you're part of it. You're making another world of childhood out there on the street that is untranslatable to the world of your parents. The twain shall never meet. And that giving a name to that street life that we all collectively experienced as children, but you could never have enunciated at the time, this was the job that I took on in the book.
The research, I want to get back to that because we talked about connecting the dots, but there's also obviously the time that you're talking about and who was present in the news at those moments, of whether it be a Bernie Getz or what was going on at that particular time. We only differ in age, I think, by about 2 years, so I'm pretty much in that same time period. And I was fascinated by the impact that had in reading the story of remembering those moments and not thinking at the time of what an impact they have, but obviously realizing what an impact they had.
Yeah. I mean, anyone our age approximately thinks about and sometimes jokes about the enormous difference in childhood now,
right,
and then. And I think that, you know, some of the signal ideas around crime and danger and urban life were being conjured up in real time by the kind of tabloid myth-making life of New York City culture specifically. I mean, the archetype of the missing child, the abducted child, was a kid named Eton Patz,
right,
who disappeared from the West Village on his way to school one morning. And, you know, this gives way to the milk carton child. And this was in the middle of the situation of my childhood. You know, he was a white boy walking down the street of New York City who disappeared. And this rearrangement around the ideas of danger and crime, and then, of course, panics, inflated, crazy panics around, and myths around what urban crime meant and what it justified in terms of three strikes laws and all sorts of other stuff that we've had to very painfully and painstakingly re-examine and reverse. this happened because, for at least to some extent, because New York City was a myth-making machine. The power of the tabloid journals and the idea of New York City as a frontier place or a broken place or a dystopian space, the abandonment of it by white middle-class families, and the bankruptcy of the city. Ford to New York, drop dead, was the famous headline, which was also, there's a kind of chip on your shoulder pride, right, in being from this mythically destroyed environment, which gives rise to a lot of art and a lot of culture and a lot of imagery, Spike Lee movies and all sorts of other things that become archetypal from that period. But living through that, discerning the reality, not just underneath the myth, but the way the reality and the myth were connected and spoke one into the other, the way they ramified into something beyond just reality or myth. That was one of the things I wanted to pursue in this book.
How you were able to pursue gentrification, and I'm curious, before I ask the full question, of when that term first came on your radar, even during your youth.
Yeah, this became a fixation, actually. I sort of researched the origin of the term because it's now so commonplace, it's so readily offered up as a description that, if anything, and I think there are some social scientists who are sort of behind me on this thought, it's too easy. People say it and they're sure they know what it means. And actually, under that cover of that name is an incredible boiling stew of different ideas and situations. Displacement of people from the homes they live in, transformations in cultural experience, the arrival of a nice coffee shop or restaurant that everyone kind of digs, but it's also gentrification. The word now covers so many different kinds of meaning. But it was invented in 1964 by a British sociologist who was describing a very specific action in a part of London. And it's like worth going back and catching this fact. The fact that the word sounds a little British, right? Gentry is not a common American term, points to its origin. And it was first used in academic sociology, political science. It was not a regular word. It was not a street word. It was not even a regular journalist's word. I began to look at its usages, and it didn't appear in any regular way in the New York Times or in other kinds of popular non-academic press until pretty late in the 80s. It was not a recognizable term. On the other hand, it did come up in the politics of my specific part of Brooklyn. And actually, my parents introduced it to me. And at some point, and I don't remember the moment, it was being thrown around so that we were made to understand that we were white people who were living in a neighborhood, but we were specifically against gentrification. We were going to oppose it in any way we could actively do so. We were going to at least psychically position ourselves against it. And that was how I grew up, was gentrification is starting to happen here, and we're not good with that. We're going to try to protect our neighbors from it. So I first learned it, in a sense, on the street, as a part of the story that my neighborhood was trying to tell about itself. Maybe not always coherently, in many ways quite incoherently, but it was trying.
I'm interested in you using that term coherent, because it sounds like you're making a case for it or against it, but you are discussing it and you're going back and forth, and it's a fascinating look through the characters, through the times, through whether we're looking at something that's happening in the 70s or the 80s or beyond, that is a tap on the shoulder to show us where we were and where we've gone.
Yeah, I think I began to see, actually, I credit myself with this thought, even as a teenager, that something was being missed by the pro or con gentrification of our little set of 8 or 10 city blocks, that you weren't really catching what the issue was if you just focused on, will this area be either transformed or protected against transformation? That actually the larger structural issues, what was happening in your society around race, around justice, around development, around economic injustice was lost if all you thought about was like gentrification, pro or con, that you had to examine these really larger structural pressures on the experience that people were having in your neighborhood, on your block. And so I started to think, whether or not like all these houses get their brick repointed, or whether we have like fancy shops on Atlantic Avenue, that's not going to cut it. I'm not really getting to the question that's troubling me to only think of it on those terms.
Do you feel that if you look at Fortress of Solitude or Motherless Brooklyn and compare it to this book, that there is a great maturation as a writer?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I'm very, very proud of those books, as I am of a number of novels that were written even earlier than those, but I'm also a different person. It's 20 years since Fortress of Solitude, the last time I tried to address these topics. And, Motherless Brooklyn is a kind of another animal entirely. It's like a Valentine. I wrote it when I first returned to Brooklyn as an adult from an initial flight. I ran away to the Bay Area and lived in Berkeley and Oakland, and my first novels were all set in the American West, and I tried to imagine that I wasn't writing about Brooklyn. Of course, now I see that I was doing it sometimes in disguised form. But then I went back there and I sort of fell in love with the street vibe again, the language of Brooklyn, and Motherless Brooklyn just celebrates that. Fortress of Solitude was a first attempt, an attack at this like more troubling, deeper-rooted, ambivalent, intense, and painful feeling I had about where I'd grown up, that there were things about it that didn't make sense and that I was struggling to give name to. And I think it was the best I could possibly have done at the time. I had to grow enormously as a writer to do it at the time. But 20 years later, I can see with new eyes, not just because I've changed, but also because the world's changed and added to its understanding, and the language for addressing and framing these questions is so amplified. And I'm so enriched by the conversations I've experienced in the wake of writing a book like Fortress of Solitude. I can encircle, in a way, the writer I was at that point.
I was really struck by a number of years ago seeing Fortress of Solitude at Poughkeepsie. They were doing there was a workshop with New York Stage and Film, right? That then moved to the public, I believe.
The Public Theater held it for 2 long runs, and it was a beautiful experience. It was a musical theatrical version of the Fortress of Solitude. It meant so much to me. It was actually a big part of the. I'm going to avoid your word maturation, but of the evolution of my responses to my own having written about the neighborhood, because to see it in a way thrown out of myself onto the stage, literally embodied by actors who were singing, it changed it for me. And I found it very moving, but it also taught me things about the Fortress of Solitude. The changes they made in turning it into a stage musical made me look at it with new eyes.
And seeds of this novel, Brooklyn crime novel, in that portrayal.
Absolutely. It was such a gift. I mean, these are the kinds of things you can't even reckon with when you're a young, aspiring writer, right? That someone might take something you wrote and take it wholly into this other art form. What a crazy gift to me that was. It showed me parts of, not just of my book, but of myself, really, to experience that.
Of the some 120 plus chapters of this book, is there an assembling that goes on? I assume that's not a linear fashion.
Yeah,
this
book was a unusual procedure of working by puzzle making. I had 3x5 cards, which I guess a lot of writers work with all their lives. I'd never really done it before, but I had every one of these 120 odd chapters and some more that didn't make the cut, basically written down in some shorthand on cards, which I then would, in the movies when they have the crazy wall with all the pins and the string connecting all the Post-its or whatever. For me, it was a crazy floor. I had my book laid out on the carpet on these 3x5 cards, and I was like crawling along the surface of my own book like a creature investigating an area and trying to understand it. And I kept moving them around and putting them in different conjunctions, one to the next, until they began to take a form that made sense to me. And then I picked them all up in that order and wrote the book.
Is it interesting to you, okay, but why did this make sense to me?
I'm going to maybe challenge your question. There are things in it that still don't make sense to me. It wasn't for me a matter of claiming that I'd solved it all.
Right.
There may have been a few specific questions about the way certain kinds of power flowed in unnameable ways in my childhood experience of the streets that I tried to give a name to. But even that's different from solving it. It's more like just finding the names, finding the words to hold it up to the light for a minute and say, wow, look at that. That happened. Here's what it was really like to go through it, and here's what it's like to remember it, and not be able to stop thinking about it 40-odd years later.
And then present that to us as the reader, where we will make connections to earlier parts of the novel and perhaps to later parts of the novel that give us the full picture
I think,
when we close the cover.
It took writing 12 much more, in some ways, traditional novels structurally to give myself the courage to go out on the high wire and know that I had in a way, a muscle that I developed, which was to bring the story home to itself, no matter how shattered and distributed it might be, and that I would deliver some of those feelings that one associates with reading a novel where you're like, oh, page 12 or chapter 7, here I am at the end, and suddenly it's clicking into place. To believe that I was going to do that took all of the toolkit that I'd developed over the years.
So where do you take the toolkit now?
Oh, well, yeah, that's a great question. I have a thought about an next novel and some scraps written down. It's not Brooklyn. I'm giving myself another break from the, what would you call it, from the source code material for me. But in the meantime, I'm going to write some short stories. I have the great luck of being invited to plan a new and selected short stories volume where I'm going to sweep together stories I've written over decades with some new ones.
Jonathan Lethem's new novel is Brooklyn, crime novel. It is published by Echo. Jonathan, thank you so much for being with us. What a great pleasure to have you on the program.
Great pleasure on my side to talk. Thanks so much.
Thanks to our producer, Sarah LeDuc. You can write to us at book@wamc.org. The latest on National Productions programs is available via the Airwaves newsletter at wamc.org and on social media at WAMC Radio. Special thanks to the New York State Writers Institute. Bookmark us for next week, and thanks for listening for The Book Show. I'm Joe Donahue.